Tonight, we're going to explore how the 12 steps operate to facilitate the achievement of emotional sobriety. Tonight, we are going to be focusing again on step four. Our special guest tonight is going to be Dr. Michael McGee, and he's going to share with you his perspective on looking at how to approach step four. I've got some idea of what I think Michael will be discussing tonight, and I think you're in for a wonderful treat. But before we start, let me say this. We've talked at length about how the steps are interdependent, that the work that you do in one step moves you, creates an energy that compels you towards the next step. And then the work you do in that step resolves the issue, the tension that was created in step one, and now starts to build up a charge that moves you towards step two. Well, that happened in 2 to 3, and now 3 to 4. And this step 4 is this taking this searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And specifically with focusing on emotional sobriety, we are looking at taking an inventory of our emotional dependence and the impact that has had with our life. And that's what we've been doing, is really taking a look at how can we continue to understand how this emotional dependency that we have has impacted our lives and the way it shows up in our lives, and ways that we can start to address it. But the first step is always going to be awareness. So Michael will be sharing for about the next 20 minutes. Then Tom Rutledge and I will come in and discuss what Michael has said. Then we will open up the meeting to share for about the next half an hour. Shares are to be 2 minutes long. Brian will let you know after a minute and a half is up. And then when you're at 2 minutes, he will go ahead and tell you that to wrap up your share. So, Michael, let me turn this over to you. And thank you for being here tonight. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you all. Thank you, Alan, so much. I just want to note just how affirming and loving you are, Alan. It's just so nice. And I'm really happy to be part of this group with you guys. I'm learning so much. It's been really, really, really good, and I look forward to continuing. So I've been wanting, to sort of approach these steps and emotional sobriety from an awakening perspective. Related to the kind of work that I do both personally in my own personal life, but also clinically with my patients. So just very quickly to review the 3 A's of awakening that I use clinically with my patients and also practice in my life are the 3 A's of attending, appreciating, and acting. With attending being to pay attention to what is this that's arising, what is this, and inquiry into what and why, and appreciation arising from attending, which is just a deep understanding that it comes when you look deeply. And also a second aspect of appreciating in terms of just valuing, really understanding deeply the unconditionality of reality, and really a falling away of judgment is really critical, and just restoring a state of awe and wonder at the miracle of our existence. And then finally, acting with love, which naturally rises from appreciating the reverence for existence and for this gift that we all share together, leads naturally to this inspiration, this call, or this desire to love. So with that perspective in mind, I'd like to start a little bit about sort of thinking about step 4. As we all know, it's traditionally thought of as a fearless and searching moral inventory. I like Russell Brand's version. Write down all the things that fuck you up or have ever fucked you up. Don't lie or leave anything out. I think somebody else may have mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. And what I'm going to lead up to and explain tonight is sort of a version that works for me. This is just, and that I use in my work with my patients. And that is, step 4 is a courageous and compassionate inquiry into our woundedness and wounding, or the ways that we feel unlovable and we are unloving to ourselves and others. So, just to give you a little bit of background on this, because I'm a recovering compulsive overachiever, when I did my first step forward when I was about 42, I literally wrote a small book. It was actually, I still have it. It's about an 80-page Word document of all the bad things that I've ever done. And it was really an autobiography of just being a dick. I really was an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. And my step 4 work at the time, really, the way that I did it only served to deepen my underlying sense of self-hatred. I felt I was a hopelessly bad person. And, something weird about it, it's like my narcissism to be special. I now had found a way to be special because I was the asshole of all assholes. So, my sponsor at the time was a very good guy. But I really wish then that I'd had sort of a more awakened perspective on doing step 4 work. I think if I had the life story that I wrote at the time would have been very different. It would have been more compassionate and less condemning. It would have been more accountable and less blaming, and it would have been more discerning and less judging. And my narrative would have been more understanding of my woundedness and how that led to my wounding of other people. And out of that understanding, compassion and forgiveness would have naturally more arisen, which they really didn't at the time. That process wouldn't begin until about 10 years later for me, when I had my first major awakening experience brought on by the pain of feeling that I had just hit a dead end in my life. So, as I said, I've sort of come to restate step 4, as I've said here. And I just want to say that for me, I don't see it as fearless, because I think it's really scary to look honestly at how we've hurt ourselves and others and how we've been unloving. It's scary because it can be so painful, and nobody likes to be in pain. It's scary to hurt. And that's why I kind of like the word courageous rather than fearless, because at least for me, I don't know that maybe I'm just more of a scaredy cat, but it's kind of scary to look at all this stuff because of the pain. Okay, now I'm going to my wife Linda said I should not put this slide in here, but I probably will regret this, but I'm going to anyway. You ready? The question I want to pose to you, as really serves as a foundation for my comments on step 4, is the question: is evil bad? And we've had a lot of fierce discussions of this in our house. To start off, I think that most of us would say, of course, evil's bad. That's obvious. But before we embark on step 4, I think it's worth taking a moment to question this. First, let me define evil in a restrictive way as just unloving, and that unloving is harmful. And I find it curious that the reverse of evil is live. I don't know if anybody's ever noticed that before. So we might think of something that is evil as something that harms the whole of life. That's the definition that I want to use. And traditionally, step 4 is couched in terms of morality and a moral inventory. And I think that's a potential trap that I fell into when I did my first step 4, because morality has to do with good and bad, or right and wrong. And if evil is bad, what do we do with the fact that we all have evil in us? How can we face our darkness and our harmful side without feeling terrible shame? I think if we're not careful, there can be a lack of appreciation that our character defects, or if you will, our evil traits, that they come from trauma and deprivation, from neglect, a deprivation of value, of meaning, of direction, and of belonging, that lead to a distortion of the force of love that manifests itself in our lives. And so, I think that really is something that we need to be very careful about. And because if we're not, we're going to include that indeed we are defective, which is what we already believe anyway, right? We believe we're defective, and defective is bad, right? So the problem is that in terms of good and bad, they imply judgment of our value or worth. And from an awakening experience, for those of you who have had awakening experiences, you know that that, that really just doesn't make any sense to judge reality or God, including us, including the manifestation of reality or God or whatever you want to call it in us, that's all beyond judgment. From an awakened perspective, judging anything as bad is just simply unskillful spiritually. To say something is bad is actually, I think, blasphemy. I think bad is a four-letter word. I think of judging as a form of sin. It is to dishonor that which is unconditionally sacred. I try to be mindful of when I judge anything to be bad, noting my judging or comparing mine, and then let it go. With this practice, we can gradually replace judgment with discernment. Then we can think of our character defects as something that is harmful or unskillful rather than something that is bad. I have to continue to remind myself of this in my work at the hospital, where I treat people who have murdered and who've raped and who have molested children and just done all sorts of horrible things. And over time, I have been able to transcend my judgment and to see these people as damaged or profoundly wounded and not as bad people. So that's that. I just leave you with that question about evil. I think it's an important question. As we think about the origin of quote unquote evil, I really do see that as being rooted in woundedness and wounding. And I see that the evil originates from two types of woundedness that I'm going to talk about. The first is ego woundedness or spiritual woundedness. And this is embedded in the idea of original sin, or what I would call original pain. And that's the pain of ego consciousness. Nature did a number on us, really by endowing us with ego consciousness. We have been designed to suffer, and our suffering benefits our survival in ways that I don't have time to really go into today. But the experience that we are separate from others is built into ego consciousness, and it leaves us kind of ignorant of our oneness and interdependence with each other. With the development of ego consciousness about 20 to 50,000 years ago, we lost our sense of oneness and the sacred. The ego blinds us to our interdependence. We're born to survive, and we are driven by ego forces of grasping or greed, aversion or hatred, and ignorance of the delusion or a delusion that happiness and fulfillment can be attained through the individual pursuit of gain, pleasure, praise, and status. The ego enslaves us to a life agenda of safety, comfort, pleasure, procreation, all the things that are gratifying but ultimately unsatisfying. The unexamined ego enslaves us to our attachments. This is a spiritual wound that can only be healed with awareness. It is the ego that creates judgments of good and bad and causes us to other others. By othering others, I mean that we dehumanize each other and see each other in more narrow terms of how others can either benefit us or how they might hurt us. This leads to a second type of woundedness, which is called social woundedness. Social woundedness arises from judgment and disregard. These are both a wound to our sense of value and worth. I call this social wound a love wound. Love wounds are caused by trauma and neglect. This trauma is inflicted upon us by our caregivers and others, and by living in a traumatizing society. We see social wounding in abuse, blame, condemnation, disregard, neglect, and judgment. We see it in the wounding of othering others. Social wounding is a reality of living in a world of people with egos who act selfishly, and in a world where we construct social hierarchies. Judgment and disregard have served us well as a species until now, but at a great cost in human suffering. Our othering and judging now threaten humanity because of our increased interdependence. The reason these wounds beget evil is because we teach our children how to behave and think. Just as loving has to be taught and learned, so too is evil taught and learned. Trauma begets trauma. Wounding begets wounding. Deprivation begets deprivation. And hurt people hurt people. So step 4 is not an inventory of defects or badness, but an investigation of woundedness and psychospiritual disability. It is a deep and compassionate inquiry into how we have been wounded and have wounded others. It is an investigation of a painful chain of causation in a less than skillful effort to live. Now let's talk about the problem of pain and shame. No one enjoys pain. We all want to avoid pain if at all possible. We're designed to try to not hurt. No one wants to look into their woundedness or the roots of their shame. As any therapist or discerning person knows, the primary cause for the bulk of people's suffering is the avoidance of pain. Avoidance of pain only perpetuates pain. We see that with the pain of addiction, which gets multiplied by the original pain that we try and avoid with addicting leads to the pain of craving and the pain of compulsion and the pain of the adverse consequences. We pile trauma on trauma by avoidance of pain. Because we've been taught to judge others, judge ourselves as bad for not conforming to social ideals, we suffer from shame. Because of shame, the unseen enemy is not others, but us. It is we who believe the messages we receive about our goodness or worth. It is we who now continue to believe what we receive in terms of judgments and disregard of others. Until we awaken to the unreality of judgment and see the violence of judgment, we will continue to be vulnerable to shame. It is we who have to see that we are creating the shame through our judgments of ourselves. So here's the dilemma of pain and shame. To heal it, we got to feel it and not seal it. To be free to act with love, we need to see how our love is poisoned. But we cannot heal our wounds until we look into the very center of them. And shame, our sense of being bad, is at the core of our love wound. And it is shame that prevents us from investigating the origins of our shame. Because we are so terrified, we will discover that we are indeed bad. People will do anything in order to avoid facing their own souls, including their own pain. Such is the terror of authenticity in the face of social rejection. The most terrifying thing you can do is accept yourself completely, but it is also the most courageous. I'd like to talk a little bit about the grace of awareness, which is the result of doing step 4 work. If we're going to take this painful step, it helps to know both the necessity of it and the benefit of it. Step 4 is about enhancing awareness. As unaware victims, we didn't see how we orchestrated the tragedy of our lives, how we fed it and perpetuated it. We were unaware of our agency to choose otherwise. We are free only to the degree that we are aware of our deepest motivations and intentions and know their source in either love or fear, in wholeness or woundedness. Fortunately, there is grace, the grace of awareness, the fact that the essence of awareness is loving, healing, corrective, liberating, empowering, and inspiring. Awareness heals. By enhancing awareness, step 4 is the first step of healing. What is absolutely amazing is the incredible healing power of awareness. Kind awareness heals. In fact, there is no other kind of awareness than kind awareness. Pure awareness is loving awareness. You can see this for yourself in your own presence practice. Because the essence of pure awareness is love, there's a natural healing correction that happens when we look closely and then see what is. Seeing our pain is what I call a healing grieving. Awareness allows you to name it and claim it, but not shame it, so you can tame it. Actually, we don't really heal anything. We just look closely. And healing happens in the light of awareness that arises with attending. In seeing, there's a natural letting go of that which harms us, just as we would let go of a hot pan. There's also a healing through pain. Step 4 is a step of stepping from avoiding to facing and embracing. We're embracing and facing the truth of who we are, what happened to us, our pain, the truth of what we've done, the truth of how we've harmed other people. People will do almost anything to avoid this kind of truth of who they are. It's just so painful. But this pain of healing, of feeling this pain is so healing and cleansing. Step 4 is best accomplished, I think, with some boxes of tissues. So awareness makes us whole. We become enlightened by making our darkness conscious. No tree, it said, could grow roots to heaven, could grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. Awareness is naturally corrective. We correct the original error of believing the judgments we were receiving. Clarity is self-correcting. When we see what we're doing that's harming us, we are more able to naturally stop doing it. So awareness really liberates and empowers. I think it also inspires. It causes an awakening to an attitude of appreciation, or what I call radical reverence, which helps us to realize our oneness and inspires this calling that we feel when we awaken to a life of love. So I'd like to talk a little bit about preparing for to take step 4. First you have to see the value of it and the necessity of it. See it as a critical step towards healing and wholeness, and as a first step in necessary trauma work. And that when realize that really, if whatever you don't bring to consciousness is going to come to you as your fate. So to realize that when you do step 4, you begin a process of being able to realize your destiny. And to move beyond our wounds and from an agenda of sort of avoiding our wounds to an agenda of love. I think that step 4 allows us to sort of address our egocentricity that arises from our woundedness. That renders us really incapable of learning and growing, and to see that it really dooms us to the calamities that we fear the most, the unexamined life. We hate that which threatens us or makes us aware of our own flaws. We need to counter this hate with a valuing of the awareness that's generated by step 4. So I think that it's also important to realize that as you prepare to do step 4, it really does take some courage. It takes being a little bit of a warrior to be able to go in and the willingness to be in pain and to feel pain and to grieve. We want to treasure our pain and treasure the conflict that we experience within, because really when we examine these and look deeply in them, there's such a healing and a deepening of wisdom and a developing of heart. I think, as Thomas said repeatedly, you don't want to take step 4 alone. It's good to have a companion and a guide, someone who's been there and healed and who is enlightened to some degree. We really need that kind of support for this work, because most of us are not in a state of what Steve Hayes calls enlightened diffusion from our self-hatred. We are more immersed in the experience of self-hatred and condemnation and judgment, rather than having some awareness that sort of separates us from them. So we need someone to model this kind and compassionate investigation, and to help us to do this for ourselves and to teach us self-compassion. I really see the benefit of doing step 4 and 5 together, so that we have support in the inquiry. I see the healing process as both spiritual in essence, but also relational. And so approaching it with a contemplative and a relational approach or processes at the same time is really best. It's best to prepare for step 4 by beginning a practice of cultivating loving awareness through what I call appreciative attending and appreciating without judgment. This is a practice which counters judgment and leads, as I've said, to the development over time of what I call radical reverence, where we feel a groundedness in loving presence, as Ram Dass talks about. We practice this daily, and with practice, we see that we really are the enemy that most needs our love. It's the beginning of a practice of what I call spiritual reparenting. And in this practice, we begin to develop this capacity for diffusion, or a separation of awareness from the contents of awareness. We start to be able to see our experience rather than just be our experience. With appreciation and renunciation of judgment, we gradually develop kindness towards ourselves. We see that we're perfect in our imperfection, that we're just perfectly fucked up, and it's all good. There's no badness, there's just fucked upness. And radical reverence even for our evil and our trauma in this loving and wounding world. With time, we develop impersonality or non-self. we stop taking ourselves and our brains personally. We see how judging arises and we don't judge the judging. In fact, this is one of the practices, is to not judge the judging, so that the judging might fall away. We also reframe step 4 as an investigation of woundedness and disability. And the purpose is to heal, not to make us, worthy or better. We see that we just set the mind frame that we're not looking for perfection, which is unattainable and really undesirable. The most we can hope for is excellence. A life calls not for perfection, but for completeness. This is the intention we set for ourselves, to become whole and complete. So it's good to go into step 4, seeing the error of linking our goodness and worth to the appraisals of others or to our own appraisals. This is part of what we are in recovery from in emotional sobriety. In this work, we take on an attitude of a curious and kind investigator. Our purpose is to look and to search and to investigate, not just once, but for the rest of our lives, over and over, continuously. It's a lifelong practice of kind inquiry. As anyone who has done step 4 knows, it does require courage, conviction, and commitment. We know it's going to hurt, but we'll be the better for it. It's natural to feel pain. It's natural to be a little afraid. Despite this, we have this commitment still to end this inquiry that we know is so good for ourselves and others, a commitment to going deeper and deeper, a commitment to really total honesty and a determination to look right into the center of our love wound, and to do this relentlessly in a lifelong way. This does require willingness. And I think what we've all seen is that those who are willing to do the work are the ones who grow. And willingness is so important. A willingness to hurt, a willingness to see and acknowledge the truth and to feel our pain, our sadness, to cry, to grieve. I don't think that step 4 can really be disentangled from grieving. I think that the two go hand in hand. This process of also seeing the darker aspects of ourselves. And we do this because we know that there can't be light without dark. There can be no happiness without sadness. Each needs the other. Enlightenment comes, we know, in part from our exploration of the darkness. We do this work to accept that we live in a world of paradoxes and polarities. You can't fully do this work without mourning, but it's wise to know the goodness of tears. But you can minimize the hurt by renouncing judgment that gives rise to blame, shame, and non-acceptance. Without shame, there is no need for grandiosity. Don't make the pain unnecessarily worse by judging pain as bad, or as anything bad for that matter. So we do this step, blame and judgment free. We see that our faults are not our fault. It is helpful to see ourselves the way we might see someone wounded in battle or someone who is blind. We don't condemn people for their wounds and disabilities. Then we can see clearly how hurting others results from our pain and disabilities. The focus is on discernment and understanding, not looking for what is bad in us, but what is harmful, unskillful, hurtful, and unloving. What we are doing is substituting accountability for blame. So we keep in mind, as we do this, though, that blame and judgment and shame and self-hatred, they're going to arise. They're deeply conditioned in us. That's what human brains do. And when they do, we are prepared to hold them in our compassionate consciousness. Again, this work requires this capacity for diffusion, and through diffusion, a clear seeing of blame and judgment and shame as they arise, and then allowing them to dissipate. So a few words about taking a step 4. I'm mindful of the time, so I want to not take too much long with this. But, when we take this step, I recommend that you follow the pain like a bloodhound follows the scent. Look into the center of your pain and of your love wound. Do so with loving kindness. Look at how you were traumatized. What is the wound? How did the trauma cause mental misprogramming? Examine how we take everything personally. Look at how we process everything from a self-centered point of view. Observe how our obsession with the wound we don't want to see makes us self-centered. Investigate the painful energy of self-hate within us. This can take some time to see. As I said, it's a continuous process. As we inquire, we ask both what and why. We want to explore the pain and how our ignorance of it has directed our actions and caused us to behave unskillfully and harmfully. We want to directly see the pain underlying grasping, aversion, greed, hatred, the delusion of our badness and separateness. We want to see how we other ourselves and others. We want to see how our ignorance and delusion influence our behavior and continue to influence our behavior. Once we see our wound, we can take an accounting of our actions, the indicators of our character, and how our character is damaged. I like to think of this as an inquiry into the misprogramming of the frontal lobes. I'm hearing some background noise, just so somebody knows that they're not muted. But don't stop at character defects. From an awake perspective, there's the need to go deeper. Actually, I would avoid the word defects and instead look beyond that into our schema. Our schema are fundamental principles on our understanding of the world. These can be just usually they're paradigms of badness that arise from trauma. Things like men are assholes and women are bitches. Life sucks and then you die. I'm not okay and you're not okay. I'm bad and you can't live with others. Really, you can't. It's not work. It's a no-win situation with others. You're either lonely or annoyed. So you want to look at these fundamental schemas and the messages that you've received and the conclusions that you drew from those messages and continue to draw and hold. Because with deep inquiry, you'll see the falseness and insubstantiality of these kinds of judgments. Obviously, it's good to look at resentments and to look at how they're based on expectations, which are our judgments of how things should be. And what we do when we do that is with humility, we experience a sort of a transmutation of our resentments to disappointments and a transmutation of what is we judge as bad to just something that maybe is sad. Also, I'd like to just mention briefly step 4 from a narrative perspective. I see really doing deep step 4 work is changing the narrative of our lives to a more awakened narrative. It's changing from a narrative of judgment and aversion and hate and blame and victimhood to a narrative of discernment and understanding, a one that is sort of a deeper appreciation of why things happened, and more of a out of our understanding, really a narrative which is one of compassion and forgiveness for ourselves and others. So what happens with step 4 work is there's a transformation of our narrative to a hateful narrative, to a loving narrative, from a victim identity to survivor identity, from a story that moves beyond why did this happen to what do I do now. So the other thing is, I think step 4 helps us to begin to value trauma, which I know that sounds very uncaring and unempathic maybe, but really trauma has potential for bearing great gifts that come with healing. It's an opportunity for a reprogramming of trauma-induced misprogramming with step 4, a reprogramming of values, worldviews, schemas. It's a chance to harness our trauma for transformation. Trauma properly processed is an opportunity for transcendence of ego drives that lead to all the kind of harm and wounding that we suffer. And step 4 makes trauma an opportunity for awakening. So along with looking at our woundedness, I think it's also important that we examine how we our wounding of ourselves and others, not only our unlovability, but our feeling unlovable, but how we fail to love ourselves and others. What we want to analyze is our love skills, our capacity to love. As we metabolize our resentments, we look deeply into the roots of our conflicts with others, as Alan has nicely described in his resentment inventory around conflicts and relationships. Finally, beyond an inquiry into our woundedness and our wounding, step 4 should also be paired with an inquiry into our goodness. As we awaken more and more to the essential goodness that is our nature and the nature of others. And we recognize the force of love, even as it manifests crookedly in our ignorance and our pain.
First of all, I want to start rhyming everything like Michael does. He rhymes a lot. I like rhyming. It's like he does it so well. I like it. And the other thing I want to say before I get into my personal comments about that is I want you to publish the autobiography of being a dick. I think that should be published. It's like, so I mean, I've got books like Embracing Fear, Simple Truth. Like I said, autobiography of being a dick is going to sell better than anything I've ever written. There's no doubt about it. It's like, so think about it, Michael. There's so much. I literally have this. I keep it in one page, but so I'm going to, rather than try to go through the notes, I'm just going to just let myself speak from the heart. I felt very validated by what you said, and I feel I've really, more than I think I have all along this process in the 12 steps here on Thursday night. I felt the interconnectedness that Alan, that you talk about with all of this, and it's like I felt the themes that we've been talking about coming back in as Michael was talking and presenting these ideas, and I just clearer and clearer the idea of fourth step as this paradigm shift where every I think the clinical term for it is every fucking thing changes if you're doing this right, if you're really paying attention to this. And not only do you need somebody like what Michael mentioned, that I always say that you need somebody that you can trust, but one of the things about it that I get in listening to you tonight, Michael, is one of the reasons, there's lots of reasons for that. One of the reasons is because that person becomes a role model for developing that recovery voice that we mentioned last time, that is going to be the person we can trust inside of ourselves. And the person who is basically, shame is not going to get us, because we're going to learn that. But what the truth is, which is we're all of these things. Multiplicity is the nature of consciousness. We have all of these things. Like Sheldon Kopp, the wonderful psychotherapist, said one time, if for everyone who's ever worried that you have your parents inside of you, relax, you do. He said, and I've come to think that the dark parts of the unfortunate and the dark parts of my parents, of my dad and my mom, are really my dark side, my shadow side. And it's like those are to be embraced too. And I can't remember the words you rhymed with written embrace, but there was a lot of rhyming there too. But it's just everything becomes. This is a lightweight word for it, but normalized. Well, it's. I tell you what, I'll try to make this in a nutshell that you and I have talked about, Alan, is that what we do for a living is we teach people we show people how they're not crazy. We don't treat crazy people. We teach people how they're not crazy, how they make sense. And when you make sense, that's the beginning of self-compassion. That's all I have to say about that.
Well, there was no rhymes in there though. I was waiting.
No, I'm not good at rhyming. I need to.
What happened to rhymes?
I need to work. I got to work on that.
I was all set up for a rhyme, and I didn't hear a rhyme.
I got nothing.
Disappointed. Is that an expectation? Did I just generate an expectation there? I think so.
No, you generated a challenge.
But let me say a few things, Michael, because once again, I just love the thoughtfulness and the depth that you bring to the discussion. This is what I'm reminded of. I always want to bring this back to the context of emotional sobriety. So what's happening here for me in step 4 is that we're developing a practice of self-examination. That there is no way that we're going to be able to achieve emotional sobriety unless this practice of self-examination is first of all learned, because most of us have avoided this kind of an inquiry into ourselves and into our souls, and not only developed, but becomes habitual and almost automatic, as you see, as we move through this process. So there's nothing more important than the key to unlocking our freedom than to be able to see what prevents us from experiencing that freedom. Yes. Phrases like "what we resist persist" comes to mind. You guys have heard that before. Mm-hmm. What I don't transform, I transmit. What I don't transform, I transmit. You know, the paradoxical theory of change that's at the heart of Gestalt therapy is that, you know, I cannot change until I completely own what I'm doing and who I am. At that moment, change becomes possible. And that's the power of this awareness. And self-examination is going to lead to a more fuller awareness. Now, there's a very interesting dynamic that's operating in this at the same time, is that the more self-esteem that you have, the more you can see that you're an asshole. it's a paradoxical thing. Is like what I keep saying is that if I really have a best in me, it can see the worst in me. But if we don't have that self-esteem, if we're filled with shame, as Michael was talking about, if I'm already feeling defective and unworthy and all those things, this step becomes very, very challenging and is very hard to do. And I think there was a real wisdom when Bill Wilson said, more will be revealed. Because the more you do esteemable things, the more that you show up in this program and start to develop self-esteem, the more honest you can be with yourself. There's an unfolding to the depth of our ability to look at ourselves, to examine ourselves, to have an inquiry, right? And to be able to continue to see ourselves. And it is like peeling back that onion. And through the years, so the stuff I did when I was in my first year in my program, when I look back at it now, it was so elementary, but it was all I was capable of that time. So
yes, that's so important. The rule is do not judge any earlier version of yourself by what you know now. It's like that's so important.
So important, right? Because if I do, I'm going to fall short. And understand that this is about an evolution. You know, I think Tom brought this up, is we're growing ourselves. The program grows people. That's what's happening here. And this is the process we're engaging. Michael brought in a very good element of that process and what we need to do to grow ourselves. But look, you're going to fall short. You're going to be filled with shame. You're going to judge yourself. You're going to hate yourself for what you see. You know, and what he talked about is the courage. And this is the importance of sitting down. And this is what we're going to get into next week. This is the importance of taking this inventory, your best shot at it, and bringing it to, and I'm going to call that person an enlightened witness. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about the value of having that enlightened witness, because they can do just what Michael did for 170 of us today, right? Mm-hmm. He can help us start to think about ourselves and think about our relationship with ourselves in a very, very, very different way.